Jen. Good
Hi,
morning.
it's so nice to see you on this beautiful morning. Hi, Lucia.
Yes, even though we're inside, both of us, we're inside a room.
Exactly.
Maybe next time we'll try to um, have these interviews outside, but it will be kind of noisy. Anyway, Jen, tell the audience who you are. Who are you?
Who am I? Well, my name is Jen Spitzer. I am an Ithaca resident. I am a professor of literature at Ithaca College. I am a partner and a spouse of Jacob and a mom of Auden. And I am so happy to be here today on this morning, even though we are indoors.
Yes. And actually, Jacob is someone who I interviewed previously. So if anybody's interested, just look through the list and you'll see a Jacob there. So now tell the audience what you remember of how we met in general. If you have any memories, if not, we'll just say whatever we can remember.
Well, I feel like I've known you for years, and but I'm trying to summon the image of when we first met. You know, Lucia, you are a friend and the spouse of my very dear colleague, who I see almost every day, Carlos. But I'm trying to think of the first time we met, and I'm wondering if it was at a film night at the YMCA that we both go to, but I might be wrong. But that's sort of my memory of one of my earliest memories of you, is seeing Carlos, seeing your daughter, and then meeting you, and you just had the most like lovely mellifluous laugh. I just remember meeting you and remembering your laugh and how it immediately put me at ease. And then, of course, we started, I think it was either then or at another point, started talking about literature and translation and my struggles to speak Spanish, how I was once semi-fluent and then have lost so much of that ability. But that is my memory, but I'm sort of wondering how flawed that is.
Well, I don't have a specific time or place. I'm trying to come up with an answer for that question that I knew I was going to ask you to. I started thinking this morning of these cookie exchange parties that the English department used to have. Yes. Or maybe you still have them, but we were invited at the beginning when we just arrived. So I don't know if those, because I remember having gone to at least two, and yes. You were there with your family. That may be, or Ithaca College. One day we went to visit Carlos. Or because when I organized Maya's 5th birthday party at the Y, you were there.
Yes.
But I don't remember. Maybe that was the first time? No. Anyway, as you can see, what we kept from each other is that we liked each other. We have been, we kept in touch, even though we don't remember how specifically we met. And I also, I mean, later on in all these years we have been here in Ithaca, we have been invited to your home. And funny enough, I remember, I think last time we went before the pandemic.
Right, it was right before.
We were talking about plans, and somehow I came up with, well, I would like to maybe someday work at a radio station and do something like that. And then the pandemic hit, and that's when I pivoted to creating a podcast and the website, and then later this. So in a way, this idea was rooted in that conversation we had at your home.
Oh, I love that was sort of part of the processing you were doing.
Yes, kind of. I mean, I had all these I wanted to do something with what Hector, my brother, had left us with, this idea of the what if I say yes, but it wasn't that conscious. I just wanted to try something with that involved talking to people and interviewing people maybe. And then so little by little, with the help of the pandemic, all these things came into fruition. So, but anyway, so one of the things that I wanted to say today was that this in a way is inspired by that conversation we had at your lovely home. So thank you, Jen.
That makes me, I mean, I will just say that for so many reasons, I could see you on this path then, now. I mean, I think you have a remarkable ability to make people feel at ease, to sort of just genuinely engage in conversation that feels interested and curious. And I just love that your brother Hector had something to do with that. That really warms my heart. I love that.
Thank you. Okay, Jen. So the moment is here. Tell us about a moment in your life when you asked the question, what if I say yes? You said yes, and you did something.
Okay. Yeah, so I would say I feel there's a few moments of yes, but one of them was, of course, accepting the job at Ithaca College, into a town and a community that I knew very little of, that I had been to once. But I do remember that phone call from the chair of my department when I was still working um, in Boston, Massachusetts, specifically, well, in Cambridge. And I remember having interviewed at Ithaca College and then receiving a call, I think just a couple weeks later, with the offer. And I remember it filled me with, I mean, really a combination of excitement and terror, just the terror of the unknown, and sort of leaving a place that you know better. And I will say that I had lived in New York City for 11 or 12 years. I had gone to NYU, and we had just moved for a one-year job to Cambridge and Massachusetts. And I felt that familiar fear that I think a lot of, I mean, academics, but a lot of people in different fields feel, which is that fear of leaving, moving, going to a new place, going to a place that was not a city. That was very different for me, having come from New York City to Boston. And I will say that when I got the call, I was very pregnant with my only child, Auden. And so and I gave birth to Auden on the very day that I was finishing up my teaching in Massachusetts.
Wow, good timing.
I was finishing the class. I finished for the day, and I thought, God, it feels so good to be finished. I'm just going to walk around Cambridge. I walked around Cambridge, went home, ate dinner, and felt contractions. So there was something about, I don't know, the way everything was plotted was very interesting. It was like my body sort of knew when things were ready and I needed to move to the next stage. And then I had my child that night. It was, I think, May 17th. And then 2 months later, we had a 2-month-old and we moved to Ithaca, New York. And we had the furniture did not arrive. We had nothing when we first got to Ithaca, just an empty room. My best friend staying with us, and Auden, baby 2-month-old Auden, in a car seat for the first day or two of living in Ithaca. But, again, it has turned out to be, I've been here for, I think, 9 or 10 years, and it has turned out to be an amazing place. One I never pictured myself in. I never pictured myself living in upstate New York. But I have come to love it. If that first year was difficult as a transition, but then I really grew to love, especially the community, um, my colleagues at Ithaca College, their families, like you. So it was a time that I said yes that filled me with lots of dread and nervousness, but it has come to be a very good decision.
It's so funny how your body knew. It was kind of a, you finish with your classes, you're done with your commitments in that city, and then you took a breath, and then Auden said, "Okay, it's time to go."
I mean, it was, I don't tend to have a lot of superstition. I don't tend to think of coincidence very often, but as meaningful, I mean, coincidence as meaningful, but it really did feel like the timing was very serendipitous. But I think your reading of it is really nice, that perhaps my body knew it could sort of rest from its labors and that it was time to move on to a different labor.
Yep. So now, just for people who may not know how different life in Ithaca is from life in Cambridge or in New York City, give them an idea what we're talking about, because visually it's like coming from this to this.
I
But
know.
give an idea of what that means.
And we've both experienced this shift, this like contraction, and this just utterly different setting and scenery that is upstate New York. We were both in New York City for years, I assume. Yeah, so how is it different? It's so different. I mean, just I'll give you one example, which is to say that when we lived in New York City for, I lived there for 11 or 12 years, and I lived there for, part of that time with Jacob. Every time we would try to get a new apartment, we would show up in panic at the apartment with all of our paperwork already completed, with to make a cash offer on the spot, with letters from friends detailing how responsible we were, letters from friends, letters from supervisors or bosses. And we would bring this kind of panicked energy to try to outbid other people in New York City. And when we got when we first arrived at Ithaca, and we tried to make a bid on a rental, which was fairly near Ithaca College, we came with that same kind of energy and letters of recommendation and willingness to bid over the price. And it was very funny because they just looked at us like we were space aliens and then said, "It's fine, you can have the apartment." They couldn't understand the intensity, the libido with which we came to Ithaca. And I think that's something that actually I remember my therapist saying when I was living in New York City, which was like, you have to have a lot of libido to get up and live in New York City. There was something about the fact that your pace, your temporality is always so intense and directed and competitive, and you just sort of, I felt like I was a charged battery, always kind of, working at this pace. And Ithaca, one of the things it gave me was the ability to slow down a little bit. I didn't get on a subway for a 45-minute to an hour commute every day. And there's, again, space and distance. And I remember getting here with a newborn baby. And we had what was called East Hill Recway right across the street, this beautiful, natural, you know, hiking spot, kind of leisurely pathway across the street. And then I remember the first thing that happened was a frog jumped on my foot as I was pushing Auden in the stroller. And then a deer ran in front of me. And I was just so unused to this, like the sensations of living in Ithaca, like the fact that there was animal life so proximate to me, the fact that there was so much sound and noises, but the sounds were not, honking cars. They were birds and skittering deer and a frog in my foot and rustling leaves. So yeah, the sense of space and distance and slowness and nature was all very, very different for me. And for a while, I kept operating at the same speed I had been operating in New York City, but I think I slowly started to adjust my own bodily rhythms to Ithaca.
How long did it take you to finally get the pulse, the new rhythm of Ithaca?
That's a good question. I think it took me a year. I'd be curious about your feelings about that too. I think it took a full year before I could appreciate Ithaca, before my body adjusted to it. I really still felt like I was a displaced New Yorker for the first whole year. And then I had somewhat lost my identity. I didn't know who I was. I felt like part of my identity was a kind of pavement stomping, sightseeing, kind of person who was constantly bombarded with sensations and sounds and people. And suddenly there were so many fewer people. And I do think it took me about a year. I would love to ask you how long it took you to feel like yourself here.
Maybe longer.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it was nice to come from that. I mean, I was coming to New York from Mexico City in a combination very similar to what I'm right now, which is Mexico City. It's the big city close to Cuernavaca, where my parents live, which is where I was living most of the time before coming here, before going to New York City. So I had that combination of I could be in the big city, but I could retreat in Cuernavaca, it was a smaller city, better weather, in my parents' home, which was delightful. And so here, this combination, so I moved from Mexico, from that combination to New York City. We lived there for 10 years. Then we moved to Brownsville, Texas, which was very weird for Carlos. For us, for Maya and I, it was fun. She was a newborn. And then from there, we moved to here. And I feel that I had that same combination of Mexico City and Cuernavaca. So kind of, I am here in a place that reminds me of home with my parents, the peacefulness, I'm at ease. I like being here, but if at any point I need the big city, I can just go to New York City and come back.
Yes.
But it was harder for me to start enjoying and seeing the value of living here, because I had Maya.
Right.
I was basically her preschool. There, when we got here, there were few preschool classes, or there were none. Something was happening that she couldn't get in.
Yeah.
And so I was basically her schooling. So Carlos was out, different from when we were in Texas, in Brownsville. Over there, we had Carlos 5 minutes away. So if at any point I felt like I needed help, I could go and visit Carlos in the office with Maya, or just walk around the campus knowing that Carlos was there. Right. Here it was a bit different because we were here, but Carlos was 20 minutes away, right, in car or longer if we took the bus. So it was me with Maya getting used to raising this human being without the help of the school, knowing that she was ready to go to school and to experience other kids and the community life, trying to make sure that I had her entertained and fed and live.
Oh my goodness.
So once she started school, so it must have been a year and a half after we arrived, like from 3.5 to 5-year-old.
Oh, wow. So
for
you were
2 years,
homeschooled for a year and a half,
maybe
essentially.
2 years, because then it must have been 2 years.
Wow.
So once she was in school and once she was having her own life and me having kind of trying to recover the pieces of me that have blown away when she was born, and this thing that is becoming a mother and becoming this in charge of a human being, it was very weird. So once she had her space and I could recover my space and figure out, okay, so this is going to be our life, and that's when I think I started to recognize that, oh, this is like my little paradise. It's a beautiful place. Carlos is happy at work. Maya is happy at school. This city is beautiful. And something that like uh, I like to point out to my family who live in Mexico City now is that I can get to any place in at the most 15 minutes.
That's right.
Which is, I mean,
That's
I
right.
can say I'm gonna go to a dentist appointment and I'm 5 minutes away. In Mexico City, it's like an hour and a half, 2 hours. So anyway, for me it was longer. So
Yes. Well, that makes so much sense. I had no idea, just to say that, or maybe I have flickers of memory that you were kind of had to be Maya's whole world for the first 2 years. And I know how like relentlessly hard it is to find schooling in Ithaca for young children. People are signing up. That's a part that reminds me of New York City, signing up like a year and a half.
but yes, there's even from years ago, I remember movies of people living in New York City saying like the pregnant moms in the playground already making plans for their babies to which school they were going to apply already.
Right, right. College advising for their 5-year-old. Yeah, I know.
So before coming here and accepting this job, how many years of teaching experience did you have?
Yeah. So I was at NYU for 7 years. And that's a good question. I think the first 2 years I didn't teach, which was an extraordinary luxury. And so I think I taught for about 5 years. At
Why
NYU.
didn't you teach the first two?
I think we managed to get fellowships to focus on classwork, which was really, I mean, a total luxury, because I know lots of graduate programs you're teaching the minute you arrive. So I had this really luxurious sort of move into teaching, where I could watch some of my graduate instructors teach before I actually entered the classroom. So I believe I taught for about 5 years at NYU, and to make extra money, I also taught as a writing instructor at Cooper Union, just down the block. So I was teaching simultaneously at NYU and Cooper Union as a sort of writing instructor. And I was teaching, I was essentially, teaching assistant for 5 years at NYU. And then I would teach sometimes during the summer. I got to teach my own class, I think 2 summers in a row, which was also another pleasure. And then I taught 1 year in Cambridge. And so I had a total, I think, of 6 years of teaching. But I will also add that when I first got out of college, I taught for 1 year with the program Teach for America, where I was a 5th grade teacher for 1 year in the Bronx. So I had this 1 year of training as a 5th grade elementary school teacher, and 1 year of teaching summer school, 1 summer of teaching summer school under my belt. But I would also say that growing up, I was always a tutor. That's how I made money as a younger person, as I was always tutoring. And the year after I left Teach for America, I also tutored for another year before starting graduate school. So I think I've been doing some version of tutoring since I was tutoring or teaching since I was something like 14 years old. So teaching has really been part of me for about as long as I can remember. And when I wasn't teaching during the summer, sometimes I would work in schools. I was a camp counselor. I would assist the principal at the school over the summer and helping her plan. So I just always had my foot in education in some way, shape, or form.
And what is it about education that interested you since at such a young age? Is anybody in your family um, in
That's a
that world?
That's a great question. You know, my parents are psychotherapists. They're as is my spouse.
Mm-hmm.
And now that I think of it, you know, nobody in my family was really a teacher, but I remember being in fourth grade and fifth grade and setting up my room almost every day with my stuffed animals and being the teacher. I had attendance lists and you know, I sort of assignments for I just loved the idea of school. And I think I was a, you know, quite nerdy, unpopular kid growing up, with some eccentric friends, and, you know, was not into sports, did not really have many extracurricular things that I was passionate about, but I really loved and felt safe in the classroom. So I think it was a space that I just felt comfortable in and safe in, and felt like myself in, from really from when I was 9 or 10 years old, I think.
What made you feel comfortable? For some people, is a place where they can feel they have control of something. When you have a very chaotic life, for example. For
Yeah.
some others, it's just the feeling of sharing something, you know. What is it for you that you find so comfortable in teaching?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, one maybe way of looking at it is I was an only child with very little family. I just did not come from a family that was very big. It was just sort of me and my parents. And I
Mhm.
had older grandparents who passed when I was, one set who passed when I was really not even born, one set who passed when I was younger. So I think in part it was, I liked the community aspect of a classroom. I liked having peers.
Mhm.
um, I think another was I really liked, I was actually quite a shy kid, really, really shy. But there was something about uh, the classroom where I could sort of break out of that shyness. I don't know what it was. It gave me license to speak. Um, I'm not shy now, but I was painfully shy growing up. So there was something about having the interaction over over school subjects that gave me a sense of self-confidence. And I think that translates a bit um, to now, which is to say, um, I feel like it's one of the few areas walking into a classroom where I sort of know the rhythms. Um, I know how to get people talking. And I think my favorite part of it is sort of mirroring back to students what I think they're saying in my own language, and then trying to use my response as a way to sort of move the conversation forward. So I really like the back and forth where you're kind of perhaps almost like a therapist. You're processing what students are saying, and you're also um, echoing it, putting it in your own language, using it to sort of model a question. I like the kind of rhythm and the propulsiveness of a classroom conversation. I really like I know some people like lecturing. I don't really like lecturing. I like a kind of dialogical conversation in a classroom. I really like the back and forth.
What do you think, or what would you consider the main difference between teaching fifth graders and college students?
I have a very clear answer. When I was teaching fifth graders, I confess it was really about modeling behavior, managing behavior, trying to um, trying to control the various behaviors in a classroom. And I would say control is the wrong word, because I don't think I ever managed to control the classroom, or but it was I think part of what I didn't like about teaching fifth grade. I mean, I love kids. I was always a babysitter. I was always a tutor, but I didn't love having to manage the classroom. I didn't love classroom behavior. I wanted to get to I wanted to get to ideas and conversation and skills, and working on skills. And so that part was really hard for me. And it was a breath of fresh air, I think, to teach undergraduates when I was both as I would tutor high school students, and then I got to teach undergraduates in graduate school at NYU. And I think that being able to get past behavior to thinking about ideas was, and feeling like I was teaching skill sets. Not that, oh my gosh, I mean, after having taught a year of fifth grade, and I think being very inadequate at it, and of course it was my first year and I was being thrown in, I could not have more admiration and awe than I do for any other type of profession. I mean, I think elementary school teachers, middle school teachers, grade school teachers are the most talented, gifted, flexible, kind of multi-skilled people I know. I have so much admiration, but I also felt very inadequate as an elementary school teacher. And I think maybe if I had years under my belt, but I just didn't feel like I was like my authentic self as an elementary school teacher, or fully comfortable in the role.
And now, what can you tell me about the differences between the students you taught at NYU, in Cambridge, and now here in Ithaca?
Yeah, that's
Are there any?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, so I did teach for 1 year at Harvard, and I would say many of my Ithaca College students are as good as any of the students I taught at Harvard. I would say my students at Harvard, and I certainly don't mean to generalize, but I would say that they had a little more knowledge of how to access resources. That was sort of a primary difference, that they sort of understood the skill of sort of contacting professors, working with advisors, talking to their RAs. And I think my students at NYU and Ithaca College can both certainly do that. But I would say that was something I really noticed with the few Harvard students that I worked with, is they seem to be more, not always more resourced, but sort of had a little bit more training in accessing resources, a little more skill with that kind of work. But I have really been just totally impressed with my Ithaca College students. I mean, there's great variety across the board, but I really think we always say this in the English department, that our majors are as good as students we've seen anywhere. A lot of us came from R1 universities for our PhDs, where we were
What's R1?
Oh, sorry, Research 1 universities, where places like UPenn and the University of Virginia and Columbia University, sort of places where we got these very elite students, schools that are very, very hard to get into, but need graduate students to teach those students. So we were graduate students there, and those are the schools that have graduate teaching programs. And I've again taught NYU students and Harvard students, but I've always been really, really impressed at, for example, our English majors, because I think they're just as skilled and as communicative and as sort of brilliant as students I've taught anywhere. And that has been a real joy. I would also say, as a general observation about Ithaca College students, they just tend to be really good natured. like lovely, for the most part, really lovely, engaged students. And so that has been one of the joys of teaching here.
Now, in all of the years that you have been teaching specifically at Ithaca College, how has your teaching changed over the years?
Oh, that's a great question. Oh my gosh.
Mhm.
I think for the first few years, I was doing a lot of I was doing more lecturing. I was doing more sort of PowerPoint slides, and I think I've had to really adapt. I wonder if Carlos agrees, and other faculty you've interviewed agree, but I've had to really adapt to the rise of the laptop, and work harder to get students' attention away from those screens. The students are just as good as they ever were, but I do find that there's a kind of absorption into the screen that forces me to be more, what's the word, more interactive, more trying to sort of create more varied forms of learning experience in the classroom. Whether that's sort of writing exercises, or breaking students into groups a lot more, or even sometimes I try to take advantage of the fact that we were in a pandemic over Zoom, and I'll have a class just to sort of vary things where we don't meet in person, and students respond to prompts, on our class discussion board. Or I have this one class every semester I try to do where we go on Zoom, and now that we're all in person, so Zoom feels a little like this technology we're all sort of reluctantly going back to sometimes, but I have them go on Zoom and I hold a discussion where none of us show our faces, and we have the discussion fully on chat. And so I feel like there's a way in which students can relax their faces, can lie in bed or in the comfort of their room. Sometimes they're in libraries, to be sure, because they can't get back to their rooms, and have a little bit of, I think students are very well accustomed, obviously, to using iPhones and text message and Facebook. And so there's something very, natural to them about texting in the chat, and it takes some of the pressure off having to perform in front of their peers. It's like showing a different way to think, and it is students writing, so it's a way to ask students to write in a kind of collective format, and I think they're much more at ease. And some of the students who are more unwilling to speak in class because they're shy or they're afraid of how they'll be received, feel a little more comfortable in a chat format where it feels like the stakes are lower.
Interesting. And that makes me think of a topic that we have been talking about here a lot at home. The use of GPT. So with artificial intelligence coming
Oh my gosh.
more and more being part of their lives, how are you going to manage, or how do you manage with that and your students? So if they have to write a paper, how do you make sure that it's actually them and not the GPT writing it for them, or them editing? How do you think about the whole discussion of, well, it's going to be here no matter what, so how do you go around it and teach them or integrate it into a tool they can use critically or in a very smart way? Or are you against it, or what is your position on this, your stand?
Yeah, it is the question, I think, right now. It is the question, and I'm not sure I have a good response yet. I think almost I recently came back from sabbatical, so I haven't even fully processed this change. I know it's here. It's not even on the horizon. It's like our students are already using it. How do I approach it in a responsible way? And I would say part of my response is that I feel a little avoidant at the moment. I'm almost like waiting to see how it unfolds before I completely alter my assignments or completely change the way that I approach teaching and having them write. But I guess what I would say is I know it's incumbent on me to, I think, either invite them to use it in a way that forces us to talk about its affordances and limitations, like what it can do for us and what it cannot do in the reading, in the sort of analysis and interpretation and writing about literature, because that is what I teach them, to interpret literary texts, to kind of summon their own ideas about literature using textual evidence. So, I'm at some point I plan to pivot to, probably next semester, an assignment where we sort of, they try out you know, my assignment that I give them through Chat GPT first, and sort of see where it falls short. I assume it will fall short in a lot of ways. I think, Chat GPT essays can feel very unspecific to the assignment. I think, they can feel very sprawling and generic and general, and sort of covering too much information. That's sort of one sense I get in where we are with Chat GPT right now, and writing something like a literature essay. But I think that's something incumbent on me, and perhaps that's coming down the pike for me, is like to figure out how to engage students to think about like what the use value of this technology is. Because I do think one of my fears, and I wonder if other faculty have said this to you or other people have said this to you, one of my fears is that the students who are being honest and not using Chat GPT at the moment will feel penalized for not using it, because it may not be as, they may have access to, again, all of the ideas that have been said about Nella Larsen's passing, or Toni Morrison's Beloved, or Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, right? So will they feel like they are at a disadvantage by being honest and sort of bringing only their own readings to it? And will people who are taking shortcuts be rewarded? So I think it's something that we as faculty have to confront. And I realize I've been a little slow to confront it, almost in denial, but I realize that next semester I'm going to have to pivot towards some sort of integrating it in some way into what we do in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. I remember a few years ago listening to a podcast that two translators have, two women, very funny women. They were interviewing a guy who was designing these engines like Google Translate to do these kind of translations very quickly. And so one of the things he was saying was that more or less in response, or thinking about the backlash that these engines have gotten, he was saying, the way I think about it is I can use this engine to translate a text faster, and then I can, because these engines will never figure out, well, at least at that point, will always need the human eye to edit it, because certain expressions are very specific to the culture, to the country, or to the specific text where that's going to be published, or where that text is going. Only the human eye can make those adjustments, not the engine. So he was saying, what these engines provide is I can translate this text more quickly, and then have all this extra time to polish this document, as opposed to without the engine, I take all this time doing the work myself and then edit, so it would take longer. So that was one interesting view on how to go around something like that, something similar. I'm thinking, how do you teach them to use it, but at the same place, as you were saying? The assignment that you were offering it's very interesting, because so pass it through GPT and then see what is it offering, what is missing, and what you as a human being with whatever you know, whatever you've learned, can see that this GPT couldn't, and what you can offer. So in a way, making them feel that's not powerful, like active, or that they have agency in this process, even though they're using this tool.
I love that way of looking at it, right? Because I think in some ways we can't just sort of deny or avoid it. And in some ways it might be a really useful tool to learning, right? So how, but I think that's a really, that example in terms of Google Translate is really useful, right? Because you know, it might help us along the way, but we'll also be required to use our own sort of human interpretive you know, idiosyncratic way of looking at something, and we're going to need to use our own powers of revision and editing and refinement. And so sort of instead of feeling like we're just competitors against it, or we're teachers running out of time, like how can we use it perhaps as a way to empower our students to find their own voices as well, and where their own agency and input are really valuable.
So I'm looking forward to talking to you in a year and see and see what happens with that in your classroom.
I haven't even used Chat GPT yet, so I don't even know how it works. So it'll be, I think over the summer, a lot of us faculty will be sort of practicing.
That will be interesting. So now, can you think of the best teaching moment you've had so far?
Oh my goodness, so many moments. I would say this is a general answer, but I will say moments where students, you get to a point in the semester where students don't necessarily need to route all their comments through you, the teacher. You feel like there's a momentum in the classroom and students are familiar enough with each other that they can actually speak and respond to each other. And you don't have to be this sort of checkpoint or routing system. And that doesn't always happen. It happens sometimes. But I would say those moments for me where I feel like it's like less like I am the centered person in the classroom and the kind of beacon of truth, which I'm certainly not, and that there's a kind of collaborative point in the classroom where students really sort of kind of sometimes pass the baton to each other. I always feel like when that happens, which it doesn't always, that's always I feel like a real achievement in the classroom.
Would you say that happens because of something you created little by little consciously, or that happens just naturally sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't, but it doesn't have anything to do with you?
It's a great question. I think sometimes it happens when I'm a little more, and I'm not always this self-aware, but sometimes I'm a little more self-aware that I have the ability to say, can you call on the next student after you so that I don't feel like I have to intervene between each comment? And that's hard for me because I am meddlesome and I have a very clear path sometimes of what I want to get to. So like letting the students take over the conversation is a little bit like letting go of sometimes of the teaching objective or the point that you want to get to. But I think it's worth it sometimes to have them call on each other and not feel like you have to intervene and disrupt the flow of conversation. That only happens sometimes, but I think it can be helpful for me to model that a few times throughout the semester, where students just sort of pick up on each other's comments. But I think sometimes it happens just by virtue of the community that is formed. And one of the things I really like about doing a chat conversation is I don't necessarily have to be the one, the chat kind of becomes this impulsive force. and students start responding to each other more in the chat. Like, Lucia, I love that comment. It made me think of X. And so there's something actually, you know, again, it's another way in which technology, which can feel distancing, can actually create community, I think, in a sort of relaxed way. So I would say that's always a, you know, a wonderful point in a semester, if it happens, where students don't feel like they have to rely on you or always look at you for your reaction or response. But it's incumbent on me to sort of teach them how to do that. And sometimes I'm more successful than at other times.
What about your worst moment? And I want another one, the funniest moment you've had teaching. Wait.
Yeah. I remember this is sort of, I remember asking students, and now I do this a little bit more, I tiptoe, or I'm a little more careful about this question, but sometimes I ask students together what they didn't like about the course, or what they didn't like, which text they didn't like. And sometimes that will just, like, toward the end of the class, and that will make students, there's sort of a, you know, a collective mentality where, you know, because we do have a negativity bias. That's like, we're all wired in that way. And so there's a way in which that negativity can spiral. Like, I didn't like this text, or I like this part of the text, or, you know, rather than, I think, the harder question, you know, harder questions, which can be like, what is something you took away from this course? Or what is something you took away from this text? Or what was a limitation of this of our readings, or of this particular text? Or so I think asking more so yes, when I just sort of open up the end of the class to what did you like and what did you didn't like, I think it can lead to you know, I think it can lead to sort of embarrassment on my part, but also, you know, also good feedback, you know, which texts really, really students just hated reading. And I've taken that feedback, you know, to heart, but it can
Why
sometimes,
embarrassment on your part?
well, I feel sometimes exposed, you know, in front of, you know, and sometimes you know, I feel like I've made poor decisions about my syllabus. But I really am, I try to be really thoughtful about my syllabus, and I'm also aware that I'm giving them texts that aren't always the most pleasurable to read. I mean, sometimes they're hard and challenging, and I want them to go through the difficult work of reading a text, especially, I think, a text. I tend to teach the early 20th century, so I'm teaching students texts that are 100 years old. And sometimes that, I mean, they contain very different attitudes than those today. And so, for example, you know, we were just reading Virginia Woolf's Orlando, and she's trying, the narrator is sort of satirizing colonialist and imperialist attitudes from the early 20th century. So it's a way to try to satirize the, you know, offensive ways that that the British were thinking of other cultures. But by doing so, Woolf replicates a lot of that offensive language. And it was very clear to me that satire looked very different in the early 20th century than it does now. And so you're confronted with all of this racist colonialist tropes, even though Woolf is trying to use them sort of to critique British culture, especially the ruling class British elites, but it does not land with contemporary students, and for good reason. And so one of the things that I'm trying to talk about with my classes this semester, especially as we read texts that are 100 years old, like rather than just the move to sort of, you know, push a text off our syllabus, what can we take from the text? What can we learn about the culture of that text? You know, again, always trying to think a little bit more subtly about, like, what of this text still has value, and what parts can we can we sort of leave, you know, and what parts can we critique? And actually, some of the juiciest things we can do as a literary critic is, I think, is critique, is
Mhm,
look at the ways the texts are, um, you know, doing problematic ideological work, you know.
mhm, mhm.
So I think there is a tendency with some of our students to want to sort of reject texts that are complicated in that way, especially ones that are antiquated or have antiquated attitudes. But I actually think it's important to sort of bring a contemporary critical view on texts of the past and sort of, look at those problematic moments in texts, misogynistic attitudes or imperialistic racist tropes, and try to unpack them. So that has been, I would say that is, I feel like I've wandered away from the question, but I would say that has been a hard part of teaching and a rewarding part of teaching lately, is looking at texts that are 100 years old for what they can still sort of afford us.
I'm very curious now to know then, what do you think of this new um, tendency to revise old text, especially, let's say, children's books?
Right? Like Roald
And
Dahl.
what do you think about that?
It's funny, I teach a banned books course at Ithaca
Really?
College, so I'm often thinking about banned and censored books. And
Mhm,
I suppose I have kind of a complicated view,
mhm,
which is to say, I am very suspicious of book banning, especially the way it is unfolding in the last 2 to 3 years. Largely, that state lawmakers and organizations are suppressing books primarily by LGBTQ plus authors, by Black and Brown authors, um, right? Because they, not only right, discuss sort of the experience and affirm the experiences of non-hetero, non-cis authors and characters, um, and you know uh, delve into experiences of racism, white supremacy, what it's like to live in U.S. culture with those kinds of those forms of discrimination and inequity. And then I had a different response. So this is a sort of confusing answer, but I had a different response to seeing, for example, Roald Dahl being updated for children, which is to say, I am a lover of Roald Dahl books. My son adores them as well, but there are moments, I feel quite, there are moments that are so overtly racist in Roald Dahl books. And I would say I, I don't think it's always a terrible thing, maybe, to have a couple versions available. I'm not talking about sort of banning or excising the older versions, because those are teachable moments as well, right?
mhm, mhm,
We were just watching the fantastic Mr. Fox, and there's a lot of uh, I think offensive references to indigenous peoples that but I think using those texts as teachable,
mhm.
but I think possibly making some versions available to younger audiences is not a I don't think it's a terrible thing. I feel like I sit somewhere in the area of both, right?
Mhm,
When it
mhm,
comes to younger audiences, because I do think it's important to think about age appropriateness, of course,
mhm,
and also to have that double view of sort of knowing that a lot of the books that are banned these days, or that are challenged by organizations and lawmakers and family members who haven't read the book, who are not discussing
mhm,
historical context with their
mhm,
children,
mhm,
who are using it purely as a political cudgel, to create division, and using it as a way to sort of refuse their children exposure to different points of view and different experiences and different cultural norms. And so I think a little bit, you know, maybe in a nuanced way about
Mhm.
that question.
It's not for or against, it all depends
It all depends.
on
Yeah.
so many things. So that leads me to my last question before going to the no, which was I wanted to ask you um, if and how your teaching experience has made you a better mom or a different mom.
Oh, I love
And
that.
that links to what we were talking about, because I also want to know now if you've had conversations with Auden with these books about understanding them in context and teaching him how to look for these things, or how to understand these books that have these maybe racist tropes or very problematic images, or so.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it is a great question. And of course, I would love to ask you this as well, sort of, how does your work in podcasting and translation, how does it impact your parenthood? I would say I always feel mixed, right? Because I always feel like my job is often taking me away from parenting, in the sense that, often in the evenings I'm prepping for the next day, and feel separated from my child, who is then watching TV or playing with his dad. And so there's a way in which sometimes I feel like and I think this is being a teacher, you prep at night as a teacher. It is just sort of part, because you're teaching by day, and then you have that sort of interim, those hours where you're trying to make dinner, be a human, but then you sort of go back to prepping. And so I always feel like I bring my work home in a way that maybe I wouldn't always if I were in a different position. And sometimes that is time taken away from my child, and I feel very insecure about it. And um, I do feel like I am also modeling for him that, as a woman, I have passions. I love literature. I'm often in a book. I do other things, right? Because in those early years, you sort of often feel like you are really focused on parenting, and so I do feel like I'm modeling for him that I have passions, that I have the pragmatic job of making money and supporting him. That money doesn't grow on trees. All of those things. So I think I am modeling. We've tried to institute something in our house so that I think I feel less excluded, where we read together about 4 nights a week. Doesn't always work, but it's a way where I'm sort of prepping with my son, and that feels like he's reading something from school and I'm prepping. And that's something we've developed this year, and it makes me feel a little less like I'm doing something different from the rest of my family. And then in terms of those well, I think especially when he was younger, but also now, I feel like I try to very explicitly buy and take out from the library books for him that are not just reflective of characters who look like him, who have a similar background as he does. And I think like a lot of us do this as parents, right? Is like try in curating books, both giving them the agency to choose their own books, but then also trying to include books that don't reflect their experience. So they're exposed to different kinds of characters and different kinds of, figures with different backgrounds, different kinds of authors. Um, Recently, I've been trying to read, because I also teach a queer lit course. I'm trying to look at children's books that affirm, that are trans affirming, in part because I think, um, in this country, trans children are, sort of have become the new political their lives are being weaponized, especially
Mhm.
by the conservative right. And so I'm very anxious about that, of course. Um, and because my child has friends who are trans, so I'm trying to be a little bit more mindful of picking out trans affirming books,
Mhm.
and also sending lists of trans affirming books to my students, some of whom are
Mhm.
training to be educators.
Mm.
So that is something the last couple of weeks I've been a little bit more mindful about. But again, it's sort of a work in progress, to
Mhm.
try to, of course, diversify the books my child reads, and also have hard conversations about what's going on in those books. And I will say just one final detail, which is that I'm Jewish and my husband is Jewish, and we have still had a hard time, although we talk quite a lot about white supremacy, police violence in our family, uh, you know, um, sort of differences in gender and sexual orientation. We have had a really hard time approaching the subject of the Holocaust with our 9-year-old. That is something we don't know when to introduce, how to
Mhm.
introduce the fact that we've lost family members to it. That is
Mhm.
something we have not figured out quite how to approach yet, and have only, I think, managed one conversation about it with our 9-year-old.
So no books yet about that topic.
No, but I think you're reminding me that that might be a good way in, to try to find sort of age appropriate texts that can
Mhm.
do some of that work for me, for someone who's really thought through how to expose, to a child something that you know difficult. Yeah.
Mhm. Well, good luck with
Thank you.
that.
Thank you. Maybe I can pick your brain later.
And before going to the no answering your question to me very quickly,
Yeah.
um, I think the first idea that came to mind when you returned the question to me was, um, all these things that I'm doing, my website, the podcast, this channel. I think the most important part is that I want Maya to see that when you have an idea, you can do something about it and making it a reality without having to wait for anybody's permission.
Ah,
So thanks to technology, I wanted to do a podcast and I just needed a laptop, a microphone, my oldest brother as a sound engineer. But even without him, I could do it. So, or the website, I had this idea and I contacted my oldest nephew who was learning how to do these things, and I gave him my ideas and he built it. And now we have the website. For this channel, I just need to create an account in YouTube and then ask people I know if they would like to be interviewed by me. So I want her to see that. And going back to what you said before, I have passions, I have projects. Besides being a good mom, a good wife, a good daughter, a good human being, I can also have ideas and bring them to the world without having to ask anybody else for permission. I mean, nice ideas. Um, not damaging. I'm not hurting anybody.
mhm.
Um, it's just ideas that come from the heart, and then they're here. So I want her to see that that's possible. I don't know um, if she's conscious about that or not. I mean, sometimes she tells me that she's very proud of me, but I don't
Oh,
know. I'm very curious to see how what she's seeing in Carlos and in me will translate later into her own life and see that empowers her to then go out and figure out what is going to be her contribution.
yeah.
So I think that's the most important part.
I love that. And I love the idea that we're modeling something that they may not be able to respond to in the moment, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But I do think they take those lessons with them into the future. And
Yes.
I love how I just wanted to say, I love how you said you don't have to ask permission. You can you can put your ideas into the world, into reality without, without having to sort of ask the world, right? You have that initiative and that passion.
Mhm. Okay, so now we have to go to because it's been more than an hour, Jen. Do you still have time? Okay.
Absolutely.
So now we have to go to based on the text that my brother Hector wrote, it's very important that we have our no's and our yeses. So the no's help us define our territory, our identity, give us comfort, define what is me versus you. We've talked about the yeses that are outside that. What if I go outside this gate that I have as my no and try something? But now let's go back to the no. What is a moment in your life when you decided that saying no was better for you at that moment, in that position, in that situation?
I love that question. And I kind of think my response would be that the no's were just as or more important than yeses. And I've tried to say this to my students. I don't know if it translates, but that I think a lot of our students feel like they have to know exactly what they're going to do right out of college. They have to sort of have this well-paved plan. And I do think that they're not accounting for how much there was so much time where I had to try things that I then that then felt wrong for me, or I sort of felt like I failed at, or I knew was a fit for me before I found something that was a proper fit for me. So it's not like I thought I was going to be, a professor for years. I really didn't. I knew I loved the classroom, but I had to fumble around a bit. So for example, I'll just say, and it's sort of like I said no, but I also sometimes someone said no to me. So, it wasn't just my saying no, but in my last years of college and then after college, I tried things that I failed at or that I was not good at, or they just didn't feel like a good fit. So Teach for America, I already mentioned, teaching fifth grade students. I felt really it wasn't the right fit for me. I didn't feel like it was sort of capitalizing on my strengths. I was an intern I'll say first, I worked for a literary agent for a few months, and was a kind of administrative assistant to a literary agent, wondering if, again, publishing was interesting to me as opposed to sort of working in the classroom. And I hated it. I mean, I could not have disliked it more.
Why?
I don't even quite remember. I mean, I think I didn't want to do sit at a desk and do administrative work all day. It was hard for me. It was it kind of wore me down. But I also think there was a lot of ego, specifically in the agent that I worked and in the world that I was working in. I think that is not always the case in publishing, and it is not always the case in working at a literary agency. It was just so happened to be that the agent that I worked with was so could be bullying in her attitudes as well.
Okay.
But I also just found like I didn't feel comfortable in that world of publishing. It just didn't feel right to me. And I was also an intern for a literary magazine. And again, I just felt like as much as I thought publishing might be my path, I had to kind of fail at it, and I had to kind of feel inadequate at it, and I had to sort of not quite like it so that I knew that. So I think I had to try things that I, maybe failed at is too strong a term, but didn't fit in with and didn't do well at, in order to know that they weren't the right positions for me. So I would say that was a version of saying no, but at one point I was fired from one of those jobs. So a combination of saying no and others saying no to me. And so it wasn't until I decided to take a graduate course at CUNY, the CUNY Graduate Center, paid with my own money, that I sort of saw, oh, I do love being in a graduate school classroom. I do love being in a college classroom. It took me, I think taking a course for a year to know that I wanted to re-enter that world. But it was a lot of trial and error.
It's funny because as you were talking, I was just kind of drawing an image. So I picture you as a little girl with your stuffed bears in front of you teaching. And then if you draw a path between then and now, or like this, what happened is that you started walking, and every time you wandered to different places, like, or maybe literary agent, nope, then you came back.
Yes.
Or maybe this, you came back. And then you kept walking until you came back to this other image, which is you grown up, and instead of stuffed bears, they're your college students.
Oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way, but I think, and this is also what makes you so good at this, and such a good listener, is like, you're right, that I didn't quite realize that I was always coming back to the same place, but I wanted to give myself the freedom to try. And while at the time it felt like a lot of failure, all stuffed into 2 to 3 years, I didn't realize at the time that those failures and those wanderings were really necessary, because I needed them to reinforce that this place that I kept coming back to would in fact be the right place for me. And so I just think it's so important to give young people like permission to try out things that might not work and not feel any shame. But it took me like a few decades to sort of get, free myself from some of that shame.
Because also it's very difficult to understand when you're a young person that every wandering from the path that you may have gives you information, like very important information that goes back to something that will lead you to finally something that enriches you or fulfills you. So every single wonder is curiosity that it's not wasted.
Right.
And that will give you back information that will lead you later to something that really you feel really passionate about.
I love that. I think that's really true. And actually my 1 year as a 5th grade teacher gave me so many helpful tools for teaching in the undergraduate classroom. I mean, just about building community and getting to know people. And so, yeah, I think none of that is lost. And I love how you said, like, in order to find something that really enriches and fulfills you, you do need to sort of, you do need to kind of wander around, because it's just not this clear translation of your upbringing to immediately what you're going to do as a profession. I mean, there's a lot of disjointedness along the way.
I know very, very, very few people who had the path very clear and had everything planned and it worked out. The rest of us don't work like that.
No, and I'm really liking, there's something that happened in the pandemic where people are sort of, leaving jobs they've been in for decades and finding, new passions and sort of discovering other parts of themselves. And I actually think that's been one of the positive effects of the pandemic, is this pause sort of made us, I don't know, reflect on what we really wanted. In a productive way for some of us. So I now no longer think you also have to be in a job forever. I mean, I think, or, and I think there's a way to sort of to even put our jobs on the back burner and sort of pursue our passions at any point along the curve,
Very nice. Well, I'm going to add a new question. I think I did that in just one other interview, but I'm liking it more now. Before we finish this interview, do you have yes in the near future that you would like to, or something that you would like to say yes to in the near future?
Wow, what a good question. Well, I think I am letting go of the idea. This sounds, I'm letting go of the idea that or I'm getting comfortable with the idea that maybe I don't do this job forever until I retire. That actually, and I have no plans in the near future to leave it, but there was something about this year which made me fear a little less if down the road I might want to try something else. And that was a big revelation for me, because I kind of thought, my parents have had the same job their whole lives. My parents did have the same jobs their whole lives. But there's something about, I do think, the pandemic that made me think, maybe one of these days I will do a different job, and that's okay. This job doesn't necessarily define me or define the totality of who I am. And I might want to try something else in 10 years. So it doesn't speak to my immediate future, but there was a little bit of a relief, a sense of relief when I thought I could try something else down the road.
Which then adds to my drawing something more. So it's you with the stuffed bears, the path, the wanderings, but the going backs to these. We got to this place where you are the grown Jen with, instead of stuffed bears or stuffed animals, you're college students. And then from there, once you've reached these, a new path is opening up. I don't know if you have something clear where you want to add. It's going to be super interesting, because now from here, so we started here, you're here, and now you have all these paths that you're going to start trying, and it's going to be very interesting to see where you end up.
I'm grateful for that. I don't have any immediate plans or any vision of what it would look like, but I think there was something just about the acknowledgement that I could one day try something else, which was sort of freeing. And I wonder if other adults in their 40s, 50s, 60s, sort of, if there's something liberating about wondering about doing something different with your life, even in this stage of our development as humans.
Well, very nice. Jen, I've loved this conversation. Thank you so much for having come to What If I Say Yes. I'm going to remind you to send me pictures, images, whatever you want to share. I will put it at the end of the video. And for example, if you happen to have a picture of you teaching with your stuffed bears.
Oh, I wish.
You were a kid.
I don't think I do. I wish.
But anything you want to share, so I could add it at the end, it would be lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was so lovely and so much fun. And there's no one else I would like to have this conversation with besides you. This was you're a natural, and this was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. We have come full circle from that conversation at your house. See?
I know. I'm so glad and gratified to know I had, that I was in sort of it's played a very small part in this ultimate plan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucia.
Bye, Jen.
Bye.